Hello, this is Professor Michael Fournet. This is week 7, part 2 lecture, and in this lecture we're going to focus on some details from a market structure entitled oligopoly. Oligopoly is also discussed in chapter 10 along with monopolistic competition, but I felt it would be more efficient to take this market structure and kind of study it by itself. Oligopoly is a very fascinating market structure in the sense that it has some features that kind of lend themselves to some rather unique kind of exploration and inquiry. And so we want to kind of proceed through this market structure. I'm gonna revise the way it's presented in the text. I want to organize it so that hopefully it has a better sense of flow as you're studying this material. Alright, so we're going to start with oligopoly from chapter 10. And oligopoly is from the Greek word oligopos, and oligopos means few. So in an oligopolistic industry, there are few firms, and few could range anywhere from 3 firms at one extreme to typically up to about 60 firms. So between 3 to 60 firms could constitute an oligopolistic arrangement. In terms of types of oligopolies, there are 2 types I want to mention. One type of oligopoly is called a tight oligopoly, and a tight oligopoly is where you have really few firms in an oligopolistic marketplace, typically no more than 10 firms. And so the industry under those conditions is called tight because there are fewer firms, and those firms will have more market power because there are fewer of them, and hence they have a tighter grip on the market. At the other extreme, you have a market structure called loose oligopoly, and loose oligopoly is where you'll have 40, 50, 60 firms competing for the right to serve customers. And so in the industry, when you have that many competitors, it's considered loose because each individual firm will have less market power, have less of a grip, a looser grip, if you will, on the marketplace. Examples of oligopoly: the automobile industry, the airline industry, those type of capital-intensive industries usually serve as good examples of oligopoly. Alright, I am going to try and take the details from chapter 10 and kind of force them to fit as best I can into the analytical framework that we've been using for the previous 3 market structures. That is, we will start with the assumptions, and in oligopoly the assumptions are there are few firms. Those firms produce products that are differentiated, so the products are differentiated. Advertising also plays a role in the oligopolistic industry. There are significant barriers in place. So in this sense, oligopoly has that assumption in common with monopoly. So it's very difficult for new competitors to get into an oligopolistic industry because of barriers. The firms, as a result, have limited market power because you could have as few as 3 and up to 60 firms. Those firms would not have as much market power as, say, as a monopoly industry. So we say the market power in an oligopolistic industry is limited. What makes oligopoly different, what makes it interesting to study, is that there's another assumption concerning oligopoly. And that assumption is the firms are interdependent in their pricing behavior. So unlike pure competition, where the firms were all independent little firms, unlike monopoly, where you had one big firm, unlike monopolistic competition, where the firms were independent of each other, in oligopoly, the firms are kind of intertwined, and they're intertwined with regards to their pricing decisions. And so I'm going to call that assumption the interdependence issue, because it's the interdependence issue that adds clumsiness to the study of oligopoly. I mean, it just makes it it kind of disrupts the flow, if you will, in terms of when you're studying the details of oligopoly. But we'll try to integrate the interdependence issue into our discussion and try and make our structure remain as stable as we can. All right, so the assumptions are for oligopoly: a few firms, significant barriers to entry, the products produced are differentiated, and advertising plays a role. The firms have limited market power, and most importantly, the firms are interdependent in their pricing behavior. So with those assumptions in mind, then we proceed to the phases. And in the short run phase, as before, we'll look at some preliminary issues and make some assertions about economic scenarios. That is, what if the firms make economic profit? What if the firms make economic loss? How does that affect the industry in the short run? And then we will look at the adjustment phase to see what type of activity takes place there in terms of firms moving into the industry and firms moving out, and how the industry starts to kind of stabilize based on this entry-exit activity. And then we will tie things together in the long run, looking at the economic scenario that will tend to be more common for oligopoly in this case. And we will also look at our efficiency tests, the same efficiency tests that we've applied in the previous three market structures. All right, so we're going to try and use the same framework, but bear in mind that the interdependence issue will contribute to some clumsiness of the framework we've been using in the previous three chapters. All right, in terms of preliminary issues, the issue of total revenue, average revenue, and marginal revenue still concern us. Average revenue, as before, is simply total revenue divided by quantity, and of course that's the same as price. So average revenue in any context is a synonym for price. We also need to be concerned about marginal revenue because it tells us how, when a firm produces one more unit of output, how that additional unit produced will affect the firm's revenue. Will producing that extra unit make the revenue go up? Will it make the revenue go down? Will it have no effect on revenue? Marginal revenue will tell us that. Because oligopoly, like monopolistic competition, is a hybrid or intermediate type of market structure, and because there is market power, limited market power, the results we get in terms of the relationship between price and marginal revenue, price will be somewhat higher than marginal revenue because the firms do have limited market power, and by definition price will always equal average revenue. Those two are always the same in any market structure. Okay. Now we will also need to determine the level of output that a firm should produce so as to maximize profits or minimize losses. And just as before, we find Q star, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So that optimizing condition for production is still the same. Find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and where they're equal, produce output at that point. The new twist here is we need to address this interdependence issue, which is going to add some clumsiness to our study of oligopoly. And I want to say more about the interdependence issue in a second. Once we get the interdependence issue reasonably in hand, then we want to develop primarily a graphical model for oligopoly. And the model I'm going to focus on is the model called the Kink demand curve model. This model is discussed in your textbook, and I want to put the spotlight on that one as a way of kind of explaining the behavior we expect to see in an oligopolistic industry. Alright, so prior to model building, we have to be comfortable with the interdependence issue. This fact that oligopolistic firms are interdependent when it comes to pricing behavior. To kind of conceptualize the interdependence issue, what it's really suggesting is that when one oligopolistic firm is contemplating changing its price, either increasing its price or lowering its price, it has to take in consideration how the other oligopolistic firms will react. For example, if one firm decides to raise its price and the other firms don't follow suit, then that firm is literally hanging itself out to dry when it comes to its competitive position. Because if it raises price, then its price of its product is higher than its competitors, and customers will shy away from that higher price firm. Now, firms also have to be aware of how their competitors react when it comes to lowering price. Now, I will say for the record that oligopolistic firms don't really want to lower price, because when they lower price, their revenue has the potential of draining as a result. But they will lower price to maintain their competitive customer base. I mean, if the issue becomes not lowering price or losing customers, firms will tend to lower price under those conditions. So when it comes to the interdependence issue, it really has two parts. The oligopolistic firm is going to be reluctant to raise price because it doesn't know how its competition will react. And as a result, when it comes to price increases, we can characterize the oligopoly's behavior as being elastic, meaning that it's very difficult for them to be comfortable raising prices. So it suggests that there is some price rigidity when it comes to increases, and that suggests kind of an elastic behavior. Oligopolistic firms are also less reluctant to lower price, because as I was saying earlier, if the issue becomes preserving their customer base, they will lower the price so that they can remain competitive. And so when it comes to price reductions, oligopolistic firms tend to be more willing, and so there's more flexibility downward. And so because there's more flexibility when it comes to price reductions, we characterize the oligopoly's behavior as being inelastic when it comes to price decreases. So they're less reluctant to raise price, that suggests that price will go up very excruciatingly slow. They're more willing to lower price if necessary, so price reductions can occur more freely in an oligopolistic industry. And so when you're constructing the model for an oligopolistic firm, you have to incorporate these two aspects of the interdependence issue. Your model has to show a reluctance to raise price and a less reluctance to lower price. So any reasonable depiction of oligopoly has to contain those two features. All right. So what we want to do is you want to build this model called the Kink demand curve model. And the Kink demand curve model is a clever way of depicting the behavior of an oligopolistic firm, given that the firms are kind of interdependent in their pricing behavior. Now, before we look at the model, we're going to still use our same steps as before. First thing we'll do in the model is locate Q star, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And once we know Q star, we can then, as we've done before, find the price by simply going from Q star vertically until we hit the demand curve directly above Q star. You take the price times the quantity, and that will give us the total revenue. Again, once you find Q star, everything is linked to Q star. And so in step 3, we can calculate the total revenue by going to Q star and going vertically from Q star up until we hit the average total cost curve directly above Q star. And that point on the average total cost curve directly above Q star will be the specific average total cost associated with producing that quantity of Q star. So you take Q star times that relevant average total cost, and that will give you total cost. And then as before, we determine the economic scenarios by after we calculate the accounting profit or accounting loss in steps 1, 2, and 3. We then extend those outcomes to make them economic outcomes by making some assertion about opportunity costs. So just like we've done in the previous 3 market structures, we have to make our results for our model reflect economic scenarios, not just accounting scenarios. Okay. All right. So we will then proceed to introduce the Kink demand curve model, and that model, when you study it, looks something like this. Alright, so let's try and make sense of the what's called the Kink demand curve model, which I have in the exhibit here. Now, first thing to notice is the demand curve for the Kink demand curve model consists of two segments. There's a relatively flat or elastic segment like here, and that flat or elastic segment is reflecting the reluctance of firms to raise price. So the demand curve is built based on the interdependence issue. So it's kind of flat. When it comes to raising prices, more difficult. But notice there is another section of the demand curve that's more flexible downward, and this section reflects kind of the inelastic behavior associated with the interdependence issue. So the demand curve for an oligopolistic firm based on the interdependence issue will have two parts. It has an elastic part reflecting the reluctance to raise price, and it has an inelastic part reflecting the less reluctance to lower price. Now, because you're basically taking two segments of demand curves, an elastic demand curve and an inelastic demand curve, and meshing them together, it's going to create the corresponding margin revenue curves are going to be like just segments. Like I have for the elastic demand curve, the margin revenue associated with it is going to be directly beneath it. Remember, when there's market power, the price is greater than margin revenue, and so the demand curve and the margin revenue curve separate. For this inelastic portion of the model, you have a piece of the margin revenue curve that will be associated with it. Notice that there's an open space between these two margin revenue segments. That open space is known as the marginal revenue gap. That is because I'm taking an elastic demand curve and meshing it with an inelastic demand curve. The marginal revenue curve consists then of two pieces. You have the margin revenue associated with the elastic demand curve and the margin revenue associated with the inelastic, and they don't match up because they're associated with demand curves that have different properties. Alright, so once you work through the interdependence issue and reflect that in your graphical model, then you're almost there when it comes to constructing the Kink demand curve. It's called a kink because at this point where the elastic and the inelastic segments joined, that point is known as a kink. So it's the kink is where the elastic demand curve segment and the inelastic demand curve segment where they meet. Now, you then have in the model, you have your costs. So we'll have marginal cost, as we're familiar. It has that Nike swoosh check mark behavior. And you also have the average curves, average total and average variable. So the cost curves are behaving like we're familiar. The only thing we had to account for was the interdependence issue, and we did that by the way the demand curve is constructed. So once you have the demand curve in place, once you're aware that the margin revenue will not be continuous, that there's going to be a break in the margin revenue curve, basically two different segments, then you apply the steps just like before. The first thing you want to do is find Q star. And you find Q star where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. If you notice, the marginal cost curve doesn't cross exactly any piece of the margin revenue. Like it's not crossing the margin revenue here, and it's not crossing the margin revenue there. And so the way we deal with that is where the marginal cost goes to this gap, like once it crosses that gap space, it is assumed to equal margin revenue. So if you notice directly below here, I have Q star, and Q star corresponds to where the marginal cost goes through the margin revenue gap. So where the marginal cost goes through the gap, it's assumed to be equal to marginal revenue, and directly below that we locate Q star. Now once you have Q star, everything is centered on Q star, and you just analyze the model vertically with respect to Q star. So you go up and down with respect to Q star. So I go to Q star and I want to calculate the revenue. So I go to Q star, I go vertically up to hit the demand curve, which occurs in this case at the kink, and then I go horizontally, and that gives me the price. So I would take that price of P star times the quantity of Q star, and that will give me the revenue, price times quantity. Alright, so if I want to know the cost, how much it will cost the firm to produce Q star, I go from Q star, I go vertically until I bump into the average total cost curve directly above Q star, and at that point that will give me the specific average total cost associated with that quantity. So I'll take that average total cost value, multiply it times Q star, and that will give me the total cost. And so when you compare the revenue to the cost, in this case, notice at Q star, the price is greater than average total cost, and that suggests profit. So the model is saying that the oligopolistic firm will experience a accounting profit based on this choice. Now what we have to do, of course, is transition from accounting profit to economic profit, and the way we've done that before is we simply say that the accounting profit this firm is making, this difference between price and average total cost, the accounting profit it's making is larger than an accounting profit it would make doing something else, and that would make being in this industry the best choice. And so it not only would make accounting profit, but it would make economic profit. Okay. All right. An interesting kind of prediction from the kink demand curve model is that because of the interdependence issue, because firms are reluctant to raise price and they really don't want to lower price, we tend to see a lot of price stability. Price tends to be relatively stable in an oligopolistic industry. In fact, one of the predictions of the kink demand curve model is just that, the price will be stable because the firms don't really want to raise price and they really don't want to lower price, and so as a result, price tends to be somewhat stabilized. Alright, so that's the basic workings of the kink demand curve model. You have to recognize that the demand curve is reflecting the interdependence issue because the firms are reluctant to raise price and really don't want to lower price. So once you account for the interdependence issue with this kind of strange looking composite demand curve, then you can apply the steps just as we've done before to try and find the revenue, to try and find the cost, and ultimately to make some profit or loss assessment. Because the oligopolies tend to be relatively large firms, the case I've depicted here of profit is the most likely case for oligopoly. Those firms do tend to make profits because of their size. They can keep competitors out because of barriers. They're producing a product that that's different from the competition, and so as a result, they do tend to make profits. So the most likely case for oligopoly is profit. All right. Now, so that was the kink demand curve model, and from that, we now want to proceed, look at some scenarios. So the case I depicted was graphically was the profit case. That's the most likely case. If you notice, price was greater than average total cost, Q star was positive, and with our assumption, the firm would make economic profit because the total revenues would be greater than the total economic cost. Right? And of course, to find Q star, we find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So the most likely scenario is the profit case, but you could take the model and depict loss, break even, and also shutdown, but those cases are more theoretical than practical. The most likely case is profit. Alright, so after the short run phase, with economic profit being the most likely case, it begs the question, how does the industry start to adjust? Well, the first thing we have to ask is, can new firms come in? If profits are being earned, can new firms come in? And the answer is no, because there are barriers in place, same type of barriers as in monopoly, economies of scale, control of resources, those type of barriers, maybe even patents that keep competitors out. So new firms can't come in, right? All right, and so if the firms are making economic profit in the short run, and new firms can't come in the adjustment phase, it stands to reason that those firms should continue to make those profits uninterrupted, because there isn't a outside external competitive threat to come in and eat away at those profits. Economic losses are typically unlikely. Again, I'm just going to take the profit case, which is the most likely one, and just kind of flow that through the process. Okay, so economic profit is the most likely case. What's interesting about oligopoly is that even though they face no competition from new entrants, new firms can't come into the industry. Under conditions when they're making profits, when the firms within the industry are making profits, they start to go into this type of gaming activity where they start playing games amongst themselves. And this gaming activity can be, your study of the game activity can become very exotic, very mathematical. There are branches of economics and mathematics associated with studying oligopoly called game theory. And I think the level of complexity associated with game theory kind of sometimes makes us lose sight of the point. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about oligopoly in terms of this gaming activity, but I want to kind of de-emphasize, in fact, eliminate the mathematical inquiry and just look at kind of some extreme games that the firms could play. So here's the setting. You have an industry where you have a few firms in there. The industry is heavily guarded. There are barriers to keep new competitors out. And so within the industry, the firms engage in gaming activity amongst themselves. And one type of game they could play at one extreme is a game called Collusion. And Collusion is where the firms recognize that they have the industry to themselves and they decide to try to work together. So they coordinate their pricing and output decisions. They in effect start acting like one big firm. They form in effect a team. Now that is problematic because collusion has some traits that make it kind of unstable. First of all, collusion is illegal as specified by the Sherman Act of 1890. The Sherman Act being a major piece of antitrust legislation designed to break up behavior that might foster monopoly outcomes. And so if the firms started to work together, the industry would start to look a lot like monopoly because they would be acting in effect like one big firm. So collusion is illegal. Also, collusion has this other property that firms within a collusive arrangement tend to have an incentive to cheat. Collusion means they agree on a certain price, a certain quantity of production. But the firms have different costs. Some firms will be high cost firms, some firms will be low cost firms. As a result, the price that they agree to may not serve them effectively over a longer period of time. And so that inability of price to always generate sufficient revenue could give firms an incentive to cheat. And so that incentive to cheat, where one or more of the firms kind of violates the collusive agreement, tends to make collusion a very unstable proposition. So when you study collusion, it's not a game that we can expect to be successful over the long run, over the long term, because it's illegal and firms have an incentive to cheat, which kind of makes the collusive arrangement kind of implode. So at that extreme, firms work together. At the other extreme, another game the firms could play is what's called price war. A price war is where firms successively lower price with the objective of driving out the weaker competition. So the firms recognize that we have the market to ourselves. We don't have to worry about any external competition. And so what they do is they go through a weeding out process. So a price war is where the weaker firms, those would be the firms that have the higher costs, are unable to compete with firms that have lower costs. And so the weaker firms will be driven out of the marketplace. Now, when you think of price wars from the consumer's perspective, we like price wars. We like them to lower price because the law of demand says the price falls, we'll buy more. But from the firm's perspective, price wars are openly kind of irrational behavior, because if they do nothing, as we saw with the Kink demand curve model, if they do nothing and just have their own little niches and just kind of try to peacefully coexist with each other, they will make economic profits. When they start engaging in price wars and the price is pushed down, their profits are going to get squeezed. And if a price war could play out, over a longer period of time, the results start to look like the results we see in pure competition, because price will be pushed down closer to average total cost. So I would suspect at some point the oligopolistic firms would kind of come to their senses and recognize that engaging in price wars is really irrational behavior. So I can't really be comfortable with price wars as being something that would be a viable game that we expect to see adhered to consistently in an oligopolistic industry. Alright, so collusion doesn't work, price wars don't work. So the question becomes, where do we end up? And so to kind of recap, coming out of the short run, the most likely case, as we focused on, was economic profit, where price was greater than average total cost. And so that flows then into the adjustment phase. And the adjustment phase, new firms can't enter the market due to barriers. So barriers are keeping new competitors out. And so the firms that are in there, the incumbent firms, however, they engage in this gaming activity. And we just looked at the implication of the two extreme games, collusion and price wars, both of which will not be stable in the industry over a long term. Alright, so coming out of the adjustment phase, at some point the firms come to their senses and say, hey, we had economic profits in the short run, why not just kind of hold our ground and continue to make economic profits going into the long run? Alright, so we expect some rationality to emerge for these firms. In the long run, we expect price to be greater than average total cost, which means the firms will make economic profit. Now the issue is, how big will the profits be? And that depends on the type of oligopoly you're studying. If you're studying a tight oligopoly where there are few competitors, I would expect the economic profits for a tight oligopoly to be larger, because they have more market power and there's less competition, and so they get to have larger chunks of the economic cake, if you can use that, relate to that analogy. Now, if the industry is a loose oligopoly, where you have more firms, more competition, and hence less market power for the firms, then I expect the economic profits to be smaller. So the magnitude of the economic profits to be realized in the long run is really a function of the type of oligopolistic industry. Is it a tight oligopoly or is it a loose oligopoly? Okay. All right. Now, so proceeding then to the efficiency test. What would the efficiency test look like for an oligopolistic firm in such a market? Well, if you remember, the efficiency tests there's the allocated efficiency test, which is the resource test, which says we compare price to longer marginal cost at Q star. And for this particular test, I think we can be pretty comfortable with concluding that the price is going to be greater than longer marginal cost at Q star, because the firms have market power. And so when market power exists, we can expect the price to be somewhat greater than longer marginal cost. Now, how much greater depends on the type of oligopoly we're studying. If we're studying a tight oligopoly, I expect there to be more disparity between price and longer marginal cost. If we're studying a loose oligopoly, I still expect price to be greater than longer marginal cost, but not as much as in the case of a tight oligopoly. So I expect this test to be fail, the allocated efficiency test to be fail, because of the existence of market power. In a similar manner, there is the productive efficiency test, which is the minimum cost test. And the criterion, if you recall, is, does the price charge equal the minimum long run average total cost? And this one is also solvable based on the existence of market power. When there is market power, price will be greater than long run average total cost, and as we saw, these firms are going to be making economic profit, which implies price can't equal the minimum long run average total cost. Now, how badly is the productive efficiency test fail? again, it depends on whether the industry is a tight oligopoly or a loose oligopoly. So in general, we can say in an oligopolistic market, the firms have limited market power, and as a result, price will be elevated relative to prices we would see in pure competition. And as a result, because price can be elevated, it's going to be greater than long-run marginal cost, it's going to be greater than minimum long-run average total cost, and hence both tests will be failed. How badly the tests are failed depends on how the industry is configured. If we're studying a tight oligopoly, the failure of the test will be more severe. If we're studying a loose oligopoly, the failure of the test will be kind of at the margins. It won't be horrible, but it won't be socially acceptable. Okay. So in general, we can conclude for oligopoly that in the long run, we expect oligopolistic firm to make economic profits. How big those profits are will be a function of how the industry is configured. We also expect there to be some allocative inefficiency and productively inefficiency, and also that will how much depends on how the industry is configured, whether it's a tight oligopoly or a loose oligopoly. All right. So due to the combination of both barriers to entry, keeping competitors out, and limited market power, oligopolistic firms would most likely realize economic profits. However, the magnitude of those profits and the degree of inefficiency depends on how the industry is configured. Is it a tight oligopoly or is it a loose oligopoly? Okay. All right. So those are some general guidelines for dealing with oligopoly. Again, oligopoly is a little clumsy because you have to be aware and you have to work with and have to react to the interdependence issue. But once you integrate the interdependence issue into your analysis, you can create some sense of flow in studying oligopoly. Okay, so that concludes the last lecture for chapter 10, the second lecture for chapter 10 on oligopoly. If you have questions, feel free to send me a message, and I'd be happy to try and give more clarification. There are some details in the chapter that are to some degree irrelevant. If we just focus on the details that we try to develop in this presentation and try to find those details in the text, I think that will give you a good general understanding of oligopoly. It's a very fascinating market structure, but it also has some challenges that we have to work through to try to understand how a firm fares under this type of competition. So, study hard, and if you have questions, again, please let me know. And until next time, take care.